I believe that in a realistic medieval fantasy world, dwarves would be the primary arms dealer of that world. Boarded up in their mountain fortresses, they would sell not only tools and metalworks, but also deadly merchandise to basically anyone who meets their strict criteria. And the reasoning behind all of this is that dwarves are very well protected in their fortresses and can't easily suffer retaliation from any other nation around them, even if they dislike that they sell weapons to the enemy, and that their natural talents, their skills in mining, metallurgy and craftsmanship would make them adept at producing really, and I mean really high quality weapons and armor at very low cost compared to the quality of the piece. Additionally, their reputation for being reliable and honest in trade and in general would make them trusted suppliers. As a result, various factions and races would then turn to dwarves and downright compete for their military equipment. However, since dwarves don't want to see their own weapons turned against them, you would need to acquire their trust, or in other words, the dwarf needs to be convinced that you would be a man of your word, or in other words, honorable. And I also would say that there would be a big difference what kind of merchandise you can get your hands on, based on whether or not you are buying directly from dwarves as a single adventurer or in bulk as a state, in which case your level of trustworthiness and honor would determine what kind of merchandise you can get. And it would be much easier for an adventurer to acquire a single potent weapon than for a state to acquire, let's say, 1,000 of the same weapon type. And this might happen the following way. An adventurer or an outsider has saved a dwarf's life, either as a doctor or in battle, and then they would be maybe granted access to black powder weapons, not necessarily guns, but more in the way of black powder mines that could blow up a wyvern's legs and wings, rendering the beast immobile, and thus easy to finish off. Which of course would greatly benefit the adventurer in question, and one mine would not be a danger to any dwarves. And again, maybe the adventurer can only purchase one single mine at a time. And of course, part of the reward for any successful hunt would also go back to the dwarves in exchange for the mine itself. So the dwarves would also profit from the adventurer being successful. And normal travelers would only really get access to dwarven swords, axes, and basically all the things that lowland nations can forge for themselves. Only not in this particular quality. Also, single powerful legendary swords or heroic hammers are not a danger to the entirety of dwarfendom. And of course the dwarves would also follow a strategy with this sales tactic. If you aid a dwarf, and you will then get rewarded with really awesome gear, or at least the license to buy a single legendary sword or a single piece of legendary armor or a black powder mine, then you will have an incentive to save any dwarf you come across. Thus, the dwarves would be protected even in strange cities. Naturally, those adventurers or civilians who are seen as less honorable would simply not be allowed to buy the best weapons, and this would really be applied to normal tourists and normal warriors, people who are not really familiar with the dwarves and who haven't done anything particular to impress them. And rather than keeping records on every single being of the world and their deeds and whether or not they are beneficial for the dwarves, they would simply hand out insignia or sigils or something else entirely, so that the person of noteworthiness would stand out from the crowd. But in terms of states, the calculation would be much different, in order to ensure that their most powerful weapons would not simply be turned around and against them. The dwarves would only conduct arms deals with really honorable nations. Again, dwarves have been portrayed in almost any fantasy world as being really into the concept of personal and family and social honor at large. So in a realistic fantasy world, this would be the idea of whom to trust and expect to aid. And naturally, if you are seen as an enemy or as honorless, your state would not be able to get its hands on basically anything that could be used to kill a dwarf. So even simple things like knives or hammers would be seen as taboo. And of course, you would also have great trouble to actually buy dwarven merchandise, simply because everybody else would be reluctant to sell you the weapons you require, because they might face retribution and sanctions from the dwarves. Neutral states would be given the standard weapons, basically stuff they can already produce themselves, albeit not in that quality. We're talking about swords, axes, spear tips, basic armor such as helmets or chainmail, and some shields, though likely not anything in the realm of full plate armor or crossbows, because these more powerful and finer weapons and gear would make it either really hard for a dwarven army to kill your own army on the battlefield, or would ensure that very many dwarves would suffer a crossbow bolt to their chest. As for their allies, those who have consistently aided and traded with the dwarves and who make sure that no criminal gangs or other unsavory individuals would be entering the dwarven mountains from their own territory, would get access to powerful crossbows, full plate armor, special dwarven weapons with magical effects. For example, they burn if mana is fed into them, or they are able to lengthen their blade, producing a magical lance of many meters in length, in accordance with how much mana the wielder is pouring into it, or something like this, along with black powder weapons, which would make a very great boon for any army. And the same goes for armor. If the armor of your elite regiment of knights is able to make you dodge on your own, or able to block incoming projectiles by firing little scales off its surface to intercept the projectile, while their lances and swords can fire lightning or fireballs, then your state would now hold a significant advantage over its rivals. And since dwarves are only selling these high-tier arms to friendly nations, chances are that whoever these friendly nations are fighting against are not friendly at all to the dwarves, which of course would be very beneficial for the dwarves themselves. And finally, those who have saved entire dwarven holds from hordes of ogres, trolls, orcs, or just dragons, they would get access to some of the most powerful weapons a dwarf can make, such as steam tanks like those from Warhammer Fantasy, which would not be seen as dangerous as you might think, because magically reinforced tanks in a world where lightning-based or just fire-based spell exists are in much greater danger from the average infantryman than in a purely physics-based medieval world. And of course the dwarves living in the mountain holes would also have a much easier time fighting off any rogue steam tank or something like this, simply because the terrain would be an absolute nightmare for any tank to traverse. But I think the most distinguished weapons would be black powder artillery weapons, because something like a mortar would be the equivalent of quite the powerful spell, but without the need to educate a single caster a decade or two so that he can cast maybe 5 to 10 fireball spells. No, these mortars could produce hundreds of attacks or the equivalent of a fireball spell without this much training, rendering them much more effective, especially in greater numbers. And being able to bring a dozen or 50 or even 100 mortars to a battlefield would easily turn the struggle into an easy victory for you. Once the densely packed infantry formations are blown to pieces and the enemy casters realize that their dispels do nothing against something that's not a spell in the first place. And the reason why these black powder weapons would be the most dangerous things, if they would ever be turned against the dwarves, is that they can actually blow holes or outright collapse their tunnels and their holes without needing to employ a single magic caster, and mortars would also outrange their crossbowmen and most mages, making them still hard to counter, especially if the enemy state also got a hold of the recipe for black powder and can now mine the area around a dwarven hold in order to interrupt any supply from coming in. And now, sooner or later, the dwarves would run out of ammunition. Now this would take many years to accomplish, but still, the dwarves would want to make sure that they won't be at the receiving end of their own weapons, and therefore it would take centuries before a state is seen as trustworthy enough to receive these kinds of weapons. And that's basically how I imagine that dwarven arms deals would actually be conducted. But again, this is just my opinion. What is yours? Let me know down in the comment section. And while you write, I say thank you very much for watching and have a nice day.